Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our GDPR webinar, helping businesses deliver compliance. I'm here along with my colleague George, the speaker for our webinar. Welcome, everyone. Thank you. Thanks for joining.
Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to Wenso's presentation for the General Data Protection Regulation, helping UAE businesses deliver compliance. So we've got a brief presentation to go through, no more than about 45 minutes, and then we'll stop for some Q&A towards the end. So, what is the EU GDPR? The General Data Protection Regulation came into force in May 25th, 2018, and it's one of the largest business regulation changes to have happened within the past 20 years. In fact, it's considered the most important change to data privacy regulation over the past 2 decades. It's had substantial ramifications for all companies dealing with European customers, and that's not just the 28 member states of the European Economic Area, but all international businesses who sell goods and services into the European Union have had to take a viewpoint on their business operations and the protection of personal data within their own organization. So, some of the key challenges of the General Data Protection Regulation. It was drafted into law, and it is a law across 28 member states of the European Union in 2016. So now that we're coming into just the start of 2020, in effect, this law has actually been around for 4 years, but from May the 25th, 2018, it was really enacted across the entirety of Europe and all international businesses dealing with European data subjects. So one of the main kind of challenges is that the fines under this new regulation have increased up to 4% of annual global turnover, which is actually quite a considerable increase. Under the old General Data Protection Directive, which was the previous regulation in the EU, penalties and fines, generally speaking, never generally approached anywhere near that sum. I think the largest sums were about 200,000 odd euros. So 4% of annual global turnover fine is a significant increase, and I believe that there has been some heavy penalties put forward up to 25 million euros. So the data supervisory authorities are really hammering down on the rigor of the General Data Protection Regulation, and one of the reasons why they moved away from the directive towards the regulation is because they wanted to harmonize the approach of data protection across all European members. So they now have a common law, which is now applied. They've now got a common fines and penalty mechanism, which is applied across all European members. And this has increased the consistency of enforcement, both within the EU and across the international business world. So the second key challenge is the increased territorial scope, and this is obviously very relevant for the UAE audience. So the GDPR will apply to all companies processing personal data of data subjects residing in the EU, regardless of the company's location. So what that means is if you operate in an international business world and you're dealing with selling goods and services into the European Union, and if you're monitoring data subjects within the European Union, and that is collecting personal data with respect to who they are, their email address, where they reside, contact details, even financial details. If you're selling transactions, if you're managing credit card and debit card payments, even if you're monitoring for marketing marketing purposes, their IP address. These are all examples of processing personal data of data subjects residing in the EU. And if you do any of those, regardless of where you're based, you must be compliant with the General Data Protection Regulation. And the way that this works is normally, if you're an international business, you will probably have premises within or business premises within the European Union itself. But if you don't, then the General Data Protection Regulation enforces that you must appoint an elected representative within the EU and register that elected representative with the supervisory authority in the EU. So you get the choice of which country you wish to operate with, but you are expected to do that, and that's written into the General Data Protection Regulation itself. So moving on from there, other challenges, we've got explicit and retractable consent. So managing consent is now a big part of the General Data Protection Regulation. It's incumbent upon you as a business to store the consent and to show compliantary evidence to a supervisory authority, if questioned to do so, that you have the consent of the data subjects to monitor their personal data and to store their personal data. So that has meant that a lot of businesses had to look at their online transaction models and make sure that their consent statements are positive and affirmative actions. You can no longer rely on implied consent or soft opt-in. So there's been a lot of work has been conducted over the past 2 years to make sure that businesses are changing how they actually monitor the fact that they are allowed and have been given consent to manage personal data from data subjects. There's been some new rights added on. There's the right to access and, crucially, the right to portability. So the General Data Protection Regulation has been supporting the other regulatory compliance initiatives, such as the open banking standard within the EU, whereby if you've got personal data of a citizen or a European resident, then that European resident is allowed to request that they get a complete copy of all the personal data in a machine-readable format, so that they can move their goods and their personal data to another company who are selling similar goods and services. Crucially as well, breach notification within 72 hours. That's now mandatory. If you as an organization have detected a personal data breach within your company through the result of malicious activity, hacking of networks, or even if it's just something simple such as leaving an unsecured laptop in a public transportation area, then all of those would constitute as a breach of personal data. And as an organization, even within the UAE, you must be aware what you're supposed to be able to do with respect to notifying a supervisory authority within 72 hours. So at a minimum, obviously, you need to know which is your lead supervisory authority within the EU, which will either be your place of your country of origin, when you have your elected representative, or your own legal entities appointed within there. And if you fail to notify a personal data breach within 72 hours to the supervisory authority, and where necessary, escalating that also to notifying the personal data subjects involved in the cases of, for example, loss of credit card or payment details, then you will actually find yourself actually investigated by the supervisory authority, backed up as a criminal investigation, and they'll be looking at leveraging the higher fines and penalties. So as a corporation, to de-risk your business with respect to the General Data Protection Regulation, we do encourage that you have in place personal data breach notification procedures, have trained individuals within your organization looking after the personal data breach management, and be fully aware of your obligations under the law to report to supervisory authorities in Europe the loss of personal data of data subjects within 72 hours. Privacy by design is a new challenge. The General Data Protection Regulation expects businesses to take privacy seriously And when designing new processes and new business systems, that privacy by design is now considered a legal requirement for the inclusion of data protection from the onset of designing systems rather than as a retrospective addition. So if you deal with procurement activity, if you deal with system design, developing business systems, system requirements design, understanding privacy by design is a key element to maintaining regulatory compliance. One of the key tools of privacy by design is conducting a DPIA, or a data protection impact assessment, and understanding that process from a management system perspective is key as well. The right to be forgotten is now enshrined under the General Data Protection Regulation. This entitles data subjects to have you as a business erase personal data and to cease further dissemination of personal data to any third parties and halting the processing of personal data. So they have enshrined this under the law now. This is above and beyond the right to deletion. The right to be forgotten ensures that any data which is basically out of date over a certain time period should be automatically removed. So this keeps in place with the data minimization principle of the General Data Protection Regulation as well. And again, failure to look at retention policies, failure to make sure that data minimization principles are being upheld in the organization could potentially lead your company being investigated for the purposes of fines and penalties. And then finally, one of the main challenges of the General Data Protection Regulation is now the mandatory appointment of data protection officers. So this is a key area that most businesses need to consider. This is completely different from the previous Data Protection Directive. Now, in certain cases, for public authorities, when you monitor data subjects on a large scale, or when you process special categories of data, you must now have a mandatory data protection officer appointed for your business. So an example of that is obviously if you work for a government agency and you have a lot of CCTV cameras and you're monitoring data subjects on an ongoing basis, or if you're profiling large volumes of marketing data, spending habits of individuals and what they prefer to come buy, and you're monitoring them discreetly and behind the scenes, then those are all examples of the need to have a data protection officer appointed within your organization. So that's key to the regulation itself, and a lot of businesses are now coming to terms with the fact that the General Data Protection Regulation does require you to appoint new individuals within the organization, to have individuals trained up to the correct level of authority within an organization, and to have in place policies and procedures so that you can effectively manage your data protection compliance in respect to the GDPR. So, UAE data protection laws. Now, obviously, the UAE, like any other international country, deals with international business, so they've got their own viewpoint on data protection laws. But I think one thing that could be seen as immediately obvious here is that the UAE has a varied approach to data protection, going from elements of data protection written into the Constitution from 1971, the Civil Code, the Penal Code, Electronic Communications Commerce Law, Cyber Crimes Law, Dubai International Financial Center, Data Protection Regulations, ADGM Data Protection Regulations, DHCC Health Data Protection Regulation, Internet Access Management, and the Dubai Data Law itself. So you've got a varied and myriad approach to data protection already enshrined within your country, and obviously you'll have the discipline and the business discipline and the processes in place within your business to make sure that you meet regulatory compliance according to your UAE data laws. So clearly this goes back to the 70s and the 80s. So data protection is nothing new. And certainly when you're dealing with the General Data Protection Regulation, that's based on UK Data Protection Act, the EU Data Protection Directive, and that itself goes back to 20 and 30 years of business transaction. So the field and the domain of data protection is nothing new. But one thing to bear in mind is that the European Union, the European Economic Area, has fundamentally changed its data protection law. And where the EU had a list of data protection laws, almost one for every country, they've now, in their own mind, reduced that and simplified their list of data protection to one common law, which is the General Data Protection Regulation. So that makes it simpler to understand and also simpler to investigate and enforce. So the UAE data protection laws itself are, like many laws, international laws, are using the EU GDPR approach as a benchmark for priming their next circulation of laws. And there is some move internationally to simplify the approach to laws and to reduce the numbers of laws as they go forward. Now, I don't know necessarily how UAE is going to enact that. They've got their own viewpoint, and these laws are fit for purpose. But certainly, in terms of where they need to be, just like they've got the Californian state protection laws, the Bahraini laws, any other international laws, all of those are relevant to doing international business. So, ensuring that you've got a mature operating model that looks at enshrining GDPR best practice within your organization is a key element that you need to go over. So, Wenso has been consulting in the General Data Protection Regulation for 3 years now. And we've got numerous business customers who we've worked with proactively through frontline consultancy engagements. And we've developed our own framework approach that on the surface of it is very simple. The first stage is an assessment phase. And what we do is we encourage businesses to take a viewpoint of where they are, irrespective of what work they've done in the past for data protection, irrespective of who's trained up in their organization and looking after data protection. You should always start a fresh initiative by doing an assessment. An assessment in GDPR looks at the 99 articles of law and asks the directors and senior business managers in your organization whether or not your organization is compliant against each article of law relevant for business and what your compliance statement is. So you'll be surprised that when we run a GDPR assessment, even with the companies who say that they are the most mature in terms of regulatory compliance and data protection, that they actually struggle to put forward the implicit inherent knowledge in respect to compliance evidence, and it's very usual for most businesses to come out with fairly low initial assessment scores. So then, based on that, we then move into a second phase, which is to implement and improve your working practices, be they whatever state they're at. And using the assessment as a gap assessment, we identify the areas of your business that need to be improved in terms of people, process, and technology. And we implement a best practice framework drawn up from 20 years worth of frontline business consultation work in the data protection domain. And then we implement those, and then towards the end, we run an assessment again, a compliance audit, and the compliance audit gives you a viewpoint that you will have a much higher compliance score, and you will be able to demonstrate continual compliance going forward. And then the final phase is the support phase, and for this, Wenso encourages companies to take a viewpoint on appointing a data protection officer as either an internal resource if mandatory requirement, and also as an external service, utilizing Wenso's DPO as a service or similar consultancy support. So that's a simple three-phase approach. And to go into a little bit more detail beyond that, in the framework area, we have 3 phases there: assess, implement, improve, and the support. And in the assessment phase, the first 2 key areas that we look to champion is raising stakeholder awareness. Now, obviously, If the GDPR initiative is new or you're having to refresh and relaunch your regulatory compliance, then putting forward a good stakeholder message and speaking to the directors and the senior managers who will be responsible for sponsoring and championing the GDPR framework delivery is a key start point. So we work with you, showing you, giving you an initial level of training and understanding on what the impact of GDPR is. Then we conduct the readiness assessment, and a key thing to be aware in this realm is that this is a regulation, which means it's a law. And in terms of who is responsible in an organization for the enactment of a law, it is only the directors of an organization or the appointed officers who ultimately will be made responsible by the European bodies, the European protection supervisory authorities. So ultimately, when we conduct a readiness assessment, although we do obviously encourage that it's a group level activity that involves information security managers, IT department heads, senior management, we must ensure that that a senior director is also appointed to conduct the readiness assessment, because at the minimum level of required regulatory needs, if the supervisory authority conduct an investigation, it will be conducted as a criminal police investigation, and the first people that they will be looking to speak to in organizations are directors. And ultimately, when it comes down to investigatory powers, the directors it's a director level requirement to ensure that regulatory compliance is enacted across their business. So the assessment phase really builds up with stakeholder awareness and readiness assessment, your compliance gap assessment, and also raises the profile of the regulation within your corporation to the correct level, moving it away from it being just an IT problem, or where it needs to actually be, which is actually a core business initiative. Then in the implement and prove phase, we look at a number of key phases. We look at data inventory mapping. We look at where your assets are with respect to personal data. We conduct compliance planning with you. We look at legal compliance areas. This is obviously needing to involve legal counsel. Legal solicitors' viewpoint is always heavily encouraged throughout these program services. We look at data governance, update and implementing necessary data governance practices within your organization. There's the cultural change aspect as well, so there's training and education and ongoing training as well. Most data protection initiatives are only as good as the enactment, and putting the awareness campaign around your organization, that it's the employee's responsibility to support the business in terms of data protection. That's a key element as well of cultural change. And then there's obviously the technical and security measures, and for that usually we rely upon best practice tools that look at the information security domain as well. And then when we conduct the implement and prove phase, by the time we've finished that, you will have in place all the policies and procedures that you need to have in order to ensure that you are GDPR compliant. Then the final support phase, again, we've already mentioned, you can take on board our DPO as a service. You can work with Wenso's EU GDPR certified practitioners, or you can look for other consultancy services who will also offer a similar level of support. And then there is the continuous compliance need as well. So GDPR is not just about getting a tick in the box and saying, yes, you're a compliant business. It's incumbent upon you within the business to understand what you need to do to continually demonstrate compliance. And therefore, you must continually gather live compliance evidence through the enactment of business processes. And at a fundamental level, this means ensuring that your privacy by design is enacted, that you're conducting data protection impact assessments, that you're continuing to evolve the best practices and gathering documentary compliance evidence, that GDPR is being continually maintained within your organization. If you can demonstrate continuous compliance, then you are demonstrating conformity to the principles of GDPR and your willingness to cooperate with supervisory authorities. And what that generally means is when supervisory authorities, if they are asked to investigate any data breaches, they will take a very, very positive viewpoint that as a business, you're taking general data protection regulation seriously and data protection regulation as a whole. And as a consequence of that, you'll be able to make sure that any fines and penalties will be marked towards the lower levels of what they're likely to report against. So, readiness assessment. We look at technology and security assessment. We look at your compliance to the GDPR principles. We look at the rights of the data subjects. We look at controllers and processors. And we look at the international transfers of personal data. So that's 5 key areas that we focus on. So key element of that is Article 5, the principles relating to processing of personal data. So we ask with respect of your business viewpoint, personal data that's been gathered in your organization, is it being processed lawfully, fairly, and in a transparent manner? Is it being collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes? Are you collecting personal data which is adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary? Is it accurate, and where necessary, is it kept up to date? Is it retained only for as long as necessary? And is it processed in an appropriate manner to maintain security? So that's the Article 5 principles of the General Data Protection Regulation. And across those is the accountability principle, whereby the director level responsibility to ensure that GDPR principles are being enforced throughout the business. Similarly, rights of the data subject. Articles 12 to 23, there's the right to be informed. That is, that if you're processing personal data about data subjects in a new way, that those data subjects have the right to be told. So that has really enforced businesses internationally to communicate with their customers and their employees that if they begin to process data in a new way, then under the right to be informed, they should actually be sending email communications or written communications to the data subjects to let them know that their personal data is being used in a new way. So we've seen a large uptake of communications sent out around the world in respect to the right to be informed. Then there's the right to access. Data subjects are allowed to obviously get access to their personal data. The right to rectification. If data is incorrect, they get the right to change it and correct it. They have the absolute right for them to remove personal data on request, and the right to restrict processing. There's the right to data portability we mentioned earlier, and the right to object, and the right in relation to automated decision making and profiling. So there are 8 data subject rights, and as a business, you must know how to, upon request, and these requests can come in verbally, they can be approaches to your counters, they could be over telephone, they could be by email, and when you receive a request from a data subject, you must know how to actually process that. So obviously, based in the UAE, you're saying, okay, do I have to inform the data subject rights of UAE citizens? Well, the short answer to that is no. The UAE citizens are protected under the UAE data protection law, but if you're selling goods and services to EU residents and you are monitoring EU residents and you're doing personal transaction of EU residents, then you are processing the personal data of those EU residents. And the EU residents have, under this regulation, their right to contact you as a business and ask for their data subject rights to be enforced. So naturally, you need to know how to enact that, and there are rules and regulations around that. So the readiness assessment looks at each one of those 5 areas and as I already described, what you need to do as a business is to say, yes, you are compliant, or no, you're not compliant, or you are partially compliant, and get a compliance score with respect to that. And obviously, the viewpoint that we take is that you will probably have a fairly low compliance score to begin with, because you will not necessarily be focused in this area. But by working through the framework, you will get to the highest level of compliance assessment that you can achieve. Okay, so the implementation overview, we've already mentioned this in the previous framework slide. So we look at data inventory mapping, compliance planning, legal compliance, data governance, cultural change, technology, and security. And what we do with respect to this is we take a viewpoint that, that this is a process-heavy framework. There's generally a couple of best practice frameworks in the marketplace which are relevant for this. Wenso has their own tailored best practice model, and there are a number of documents that we tailor in order to make sure that you've got all the policies and procedures in place. And we work with you to tailor these policies and procedures to your business and to train up your departments in order to enact these policies and procedures. And by working through each one of these stages, you actually enact an implementation framework within your business. In legal and compliance areas, this is the need to appoint legal counsel and take legal advice is heavily recommended. It's recommended in the regulation itself, and obviously it's best practice in business as a whole. So we look at the supplier analysis, we look at the controllers and processors, and the data sharing, data agreements that you have between you. We look at data subject rights, which we just mentioned previously. We look at the data impact assessments, data transfers, international transfers as well, and making sure that you have all of the right contract clauses in place to make sure that you are meeting the full regulatory compliance need. And obviously key is the personal data breach, understanding what your obligations are and how to respond to that, and making sure that you've got nominated individuals within your business responsible for dealing with personal data breach. And again, if you are a UAE business and you don't have a physical business address in the EU, but you need to be GDPR compliant because you're monitoring EU data subjects or selling goods and services into the EU, then you need to appoint an elected representative within EU. And normally your own legal and compliance team can help you operate with that at a minimal kind of expectation. There are other legal businesses who will set up your nominated representative within EU by purely working with your legal teams, and it's just in essence a PO box. But it is the way that supervisory authorities will contact you. It is the first port of call, and it is your minimal regulatory compliance need for an international business. So you need to take a viewpoint on that, and obviously taking legal advice from your corporate solicitors is a key concern in this area. So if you've not done so, please do so in this coming quarters. So GDPR implementation, data governance, obviously as this is data protection, data governance is very, very key. So we look at the processing activities within your business. We document an inventory of processing activities that is titled the Record of Processing Activities, or the ROPA. The ROPA for companies over 250 employees, ROPA is mandatory and has to be documented and able to be presented to supervisory authorities on demand. So that's a key element to understand as well. Within your inventory of processing activities, you must document all processing personal data that goes on within your business. You must document the legitimate interest assessments and the legal basis of processing of every personal data, be that either consent basis or contract or legitimate interest within the public interest. You must document all of that. If you don't document it and a supervisory authority begins to investigate you, and that's one of the first things they ask is, do you have your record of processing activity? If you can't produce that on demand within literally the first hour or two of them visiting you or contacting you, then please be aware that they will take a dim viewpoint on that, and you would tend towards higher fines or penalties if they were to occur. Personal data framework, we work with you to build that up. We put in place your data protection policies, your privacy notices, and document whether or not you need to appoint a mandatory data protection officer based on the type of processing of personal data we do. Data subject rights, we enshrine those in policies and procedures. We give you a data subject consent form, and we look at the methods for managing DSAR policies and the framework around that. Personal data transfers as well. There is a transfer mechanisms that must be understood, looking at your legal obligations with respect to international transfers, be those either binding corporate rules, model contract clauses, adequate measures, adequacy decisions as well. All of those sorts of assessments need to be conducted on the nature of the personal data you deal with internationally. Cultural change aspects. Obviously, this is a leadership initiative that needs to be taken forward. Refreshing regulatory compliance is a leadership initiative. Training up leader managers to be able to build the domain of regulatory compliance is a key challenge. Either you work in a business that needs to do it because you're heavily regulated as an industry. Examples of that would be pharmacy or financial or banking or safety critical industries. But if you work in just generally retail or goods and services, then you might not have the same kind of viewpoint on regulatory compliance. So GDPR, however, is agnostic to whatever industry you're working in. It's the same across all industries. So part of the cultural change is building up the message for the need to have good regulatory compliance of general data protection regulation, and understanding that it's a best practice. That the UAE data protection laws, for example, doesn't have the same level of management procedures or international standards written specifically for UAE laws. So generally speaking, when you deal with data protection laws, policies and measures, you're dealing with international standards. Some of those are ISO standards, ISO 27K, for example, or the BS privacy standards from the British Standard Institute. All of those are key elements of understanding that this is international business that we're dealing with, international regulation. And if you've got good mature policies and procedures drawn from which is essentially the world's largest trading bloc, which is the European Union, being enacted within your international business, then you can be sure that you're working towards the highest level of maturity for the standards and laws of whatever region you're working in. And that includes areas such as the Californian state laws and the US data privacy laws, which are changing next year as well. So policies and procedures are obviously very key for that. And developing an effective communication plan and championing the initiative throughout your organization are all key areas that you need to consider when doing this business transformation initiative for the GDPR. And GDPR implementation does include technology and security aspects. A lot of businesses try and treat it like a purely technological solution. Yes, you're dealing with data. Yes, you're dealing with data subjects. That therefore means it's an IT problem. Well, clearly, it's not. We deal with this as a business operating model, which requires you to deal with it in terms of people, process, and technology in that order. So technology is a key concern, but to be brutally honest with you, you can be GDPR compliant working purely with document-based management systems. And we found a number of our organizations are more than willing to do that. Other organizations, because they're much larger, have got a much more complex challenge. So therefore, technology and security options are absolutely necessary for them. So generally speaking, technology options deal with data breach management, or security management as two key services, and the data breach management looks at breach response, managing ticket queues, notification forms, automatically notifying the supervisory authorities and maintaining a data breach register. A majority of companies will focus on making sure that their data breach management is supported by some form of technology footprint. But security management and IT security policies also need to take a viewpoint as well. Do you know where all your personal data is in your entire network? Is it in structured data? Is it in unstructured data? Could you rapidly respond to ensuring that your IT security policy is being enforced in respect to a data breach? Or could you proactively show that you're doing data minimization principles? All of these require the technology team to take a viewpoint. The regulatory compliance of data requires you to look at things such as enforcing IT security policy, enforcing your retention policies, and just basically doing good data management across your network. So irrespective of what law you're working with, GDPR, within the European Union at least, has enforced businesses across all 28 countries to take a fresh viewpoint and making sure they look after the data of EU residents. And also take a fresh viewpoint of looking after the network with respect to making sure that data is being securely maintained. Two very, very key areas. And this is the reason why the GDPR actually has come into force in May 25th, 2018. So, briefly, there are 10 key stages of GDPR implementation, and this is based on European-wide, industry-recognized best practice framework development. So, the first phase is a preparation project, and bear in mind that this is a project. So normally we work with you to develop a project plan, identifying the key resources and the timeframes and the deliverables to work through. Then there is the definition of GDPR roles within the organization, and here we work with HR to define the actual roles and the competency necessary to manage GDPR. This includes information security managers, a job description for the DPO, which is necessary to be understood. Even if you don't need to appoint a DPO, you should, within a business, already understand what a DPO should actually have to do and work towards potentially developing roles towards the DPO, formally or informally. So normally there will also be a role description for data privacy champions or internal privacy officers who work with DPOs or in lieu of DPO services. There's awareness and training is also conducted right at the beginning of the implementation framework as well. Then a key area is personal data mapping. That can either be, first of all, you have to develop your ROPA, your record of processing activities, looking at the lawful basis of processing in all instances, but it can also include using deep dive GDPR data scanning tools that will scan your entire network and come out with classification of GDPR automatically. Then there is the development of privacy notices and policies and notices. Those are the privacy notices that you see on all websites, the privacy policies. They've all had to be updated internationally and within the EU. You see most companies have actually changed their their privacy policy to take a viewpoint on being compliant with Article 13 and Article 14 of the EU GDPR law. And if you've received any email communications from companies saying we've changed our privacy policy within the past 2 or 3 years, it has been specifically because they've had to update their privacy policies to be GDPR compliant. If you've not done so within your own online privacy policies, then please take a viewpoint that that might be a fairly glaringly obvious omission from your own business practice point of view. Rights of the data subject, key is enforcing the data subject access rights workflow. So we document with you that on process policies and procedures, and again, if necessary, back it up with the right tools in order to enact it across your business. Stage 6, controllers and processors, the lawful basis of processing of your contracts must be reviewed by your legal team, and if you need to put in new schedules identifying personal data and the security controls and mechanisms in support of that, then this is a key area that business need to look at, and this is a key area within the EU at least that companies have been looking at doing, forming stronger contracts between themselves and their business-to-business customers. Making sure your contracts are what's termed as GDPR compliant requires taking a viewpoint on drawing up model contract clauses which are based on European and industry best practice as well. DPIA assessments are trained and conducted. You look at what processing of personal data is taking place, you run an assessment, and you come out with a risk treatment plan which really helps you improve the security and information security architecture across your network. And it's a key element of demonstrating compliance evidence is, have you run a DPIA? Are you doing new processing of personal data in new ways? Can you demonstrate that you know how to do a DPIA and that you've documented DPIAs within your business? That's a regulatory compliant with requirement of GDPR. International transfers, there's documentation that describes how you are supposed to form international transfers. I already mentioned binding corporate rules, model contract clauses, EU, US Privacy Shield. All of those are actually detailed in the framework itself. And then personal data breach management. So that is obviously if there's an information security breach and that results in the loss of personal data, then you must report to the supervisory authority and or the data subjects within 72 hours. And then the 10th stage is project closure. And what we do at the 10th stage is we run an audit of your framework enactment and obviously get you up to the highest level of GDPR compliance score if necessary. So they're the 10 key stages of GDPR frameworks. So who is responsible for working with this? Well, as we've already mentioned, directors. This is a director level requirement to ensure that GDPR is enforced, and supervisory authorities, if they come and speak to your business, will very rapidly gain an audience with the directors to ensure that this is being treated with the right respect. Normally, if the supervisory authorities do formal investigation, it will be a police matter and it will be a criminal investigation. So obviously, everything we're doing up to this point is avoiding that. Ensuring that directors are one of the first roles which are involved in GDPR programs and initiatives is a key element of that. This isn't an IT project. This isn't a HR project. This isn't a business development project. This is a regulatory compliance corporate framework that needs to be supported and championed by the board and the directors. Obviously, the DPO role we've mentioned, information security manager. HR is very key, maintaining the competency and the support within the business and maintaining that over the next 5 to 8 years planning horizon is a key element of human resources. It's stage 2 of the project, in fact. Legal compliance, you must seek legal review, particularly in controls and processes. Looking at your corporate contracts, making sure they are compliant according to international standards is a key challenge for the legal teams. IT department, obviously going to have to get involved, Article 32, the information security needs, but also building up a team of data privacy champions within the organization, those people responsible for the day-to-day administration of the policies and procedures, and ensuring that senior business management are involved so that they know that when they develop new business practices that they need to actually enact the DPIA and privacy by design measures. So we're running out of time now, so I'm just going to try and rattle through the final few slides, not a lot more to go. So data protection in terms of average company sizes. So based on your company turnover, if you operate under 100 million euros, apologies, it's in euros, these metrics, normally you need, we find when conducting a survey, about 9 members of staff in order to look after the GDPR program. 2 of those will be full-time employees, so generally speaking, a senior director or a key member of staff as a DPO, and then there'll be anything up to 7 part-time individuals. If you've got company turnover from 100 million to 999 million, 20 members of staff, 10 full-time, 10 part-time. Similarly, if you've got 1 billion to 24 billion, that's 23 members of staff. And then 24 billion plus, that's 95 members of staff. So obviously, your company is going to be performing somewhere within these boundaries. And these are the typical team sizes. So if you are coming here just on your own, and you're solely representing your organization, then you should maybe, one of the key takeaways from this briefing is to understand that, you know, on average, other companies in your domain have already formed teams over the past 2 to 3 years, numbering these teams of individuals. So if you are a small focal team, then please look to grow your team in order to meet the actual average team makeup for maintaining data protection regulatory compliance. So funding of program initiatives, again, similar bounding, under 100 million, 100 to 99, 1 to 24 billion, 24 billion plus. So the key takeaway from this is that the programs are not cheap on average. 286, ranging from 286,000 up to 3.6 million. So this is the standard investment on annual budget spend. Obviously, a large part of that is the salary, so anybody working on the regulatory team obviously takes a salary. But key areas you need to invest in as well with your budgets is outside counsel, tech tools, professional development, and consultancy services. So if you are looking to secure a budget, then there's a general expectation that these are the levels of investment that other companies are actually putting towards their GRC and protecting their regulatory compliance. And to be brutally honest with you, if you work in a 24 billion euro company, then 3.6 million euros per annum is the sort of level of investment that you would need to have to protect the data within your network. And obviously, the way you factor that out is if you didn't invest in that, then the risk is that if something went wrong and you had a serious personal data breach, then 4% of 24 billion euros is obviously far, far more than 3.6 million. So it's a direct offset there based on the level of investment, based on the risk profile that your company faces. So what do we need to protect the data? Well, we've already covered this in this great extent, so I'm just going to brush over this. This is an operating model, business transformation, people, process, technology, in that order. We recommend you follow a 3-phase process: assessment, implement, improve, and then support. You look to actually internalize roles within your organization for data protection, not just for GDPR, obviously for UAE laws as well, and for any other international laws that you're dealing with around the world. Look to develop a portfolio of products and services, and crucially, take on board the IAPP training as well. And Wenso offers IAPP training. Now, I'm just going to hand over to my colleague, Shafuddin, who actually deals with the IAPP training. He's better qualified to explain on these than me.
Thank you, George. Wenso has partnered with the world's premier privacy program certification provider, which is IAPP, International Association of Privacy Professionals. Through them, we deliver courses, privacy courses, helping companies and businesses and individuals in UAE and around the world. We offer certified information privacy professional program, certified information privacy manager program, certified information privacy technologist program. So this is the information privacy professional. The CIPP is the what of the regulation or the privacy program. So depending upon the jurisdiction, like in our STEM today, it is to deal with the Europe GDPR. So it is CIPPE. So you will know what's the laws and regulations and terminology and everything. In terms of CIPM, irrespective of the jurisdictions, it is for the management of the privacy program. And in terms of CIPT, this is how to implement the privacy program. So CIPP is for you if you are responsible in your business for legal, compliance, information management, data governance, and human resources. And for any individual who wants to upgrade or get certified in a privacy domain. CIPM, the Privacy Manager program, is for risk managers, privacy operation managers, accountability, audits, and privacy analytics as well. Whereas CIPT is for you if you're responsible for information technology within your business, information security, software engineering, and privacy by design. Moving on to the what you will learn. So all of these are based on ANSI standards, which is American National Standards Institute. So all this is a certification which you get from IAPP and ANSI. What you will learn in each of them are 2-day training programs. As I mentioned earlier, CIPPE, it gives you an introduction to the European data protection, regulatory frameworks, legislative framework, compliance with European data protection laws and regulations, transfers of data internationally outside the EU, and rights of the data subjects. Whereas the CIPM training will help you in learning how to create a company vision, how to structure the privacy team, how to develop and implement a privacy program framework, and how to communicate with stakeholders, not only internally as well as externally, how to measure the performance and audit of how the privacy program is going on, privacy program operational life cycle. Moving on to CIPT, it's again a 2-day training course. What you will learn in this is critical privacy concepts and practices that impact IT, consumer privacy expectations and responsibilities, how to embed privacy into early stages of IT products and services development, so that there's no need for changing once it's done. So basically it is privacy by design, and the final one is how to establish privacy practices for data collection and transfers. So this, the whole training which my colleague George has mentioned earlier in terms of framework, it will help you how to know what's the regulation, how to do it, and how to implement technology-wise. All these are 2-day courses. You can get more information by logging onto our website, wensotraining.co.uk. Moving on to data protection as a service, Wenso also provides this and has been providing for the last 2 years. We have a manned 24/7 help desk by a certified practitioners with a GDPR management system in place. So what we provide in the service is be the point of contact for the supervisory authorities on behalf of our clients, be the point of contact for data subjects of our clients, and as well as staff of the of our client, encourage a culture of data protection within organization, but awareness trainings, give advice to data controllers on matters of data protection and GDPR, and be the go-to person for advice on all aspects regarding GDPR and data protection. So my colleague George will go over through the products and services.
So just briefly, come up to the end of the presentation now. As we mentioned, technology aspect, Wenso partners with some of the world's leading system providers that support technological service offerings for GDPR. And even though I said, obviously, try and treat this in terms of business operating model with people, process, and technology in that order, sometimes businesses can't help themselves but take a technological viewpoint to start with and try and deal this as a technical challenge. So just to let you know, Wenso is here to support you in that initiative as well. So the 2 key separations, if you remember earlier, we have the GDPR management systems. So these are systems that look after supporting your DSAR process. They put in place tools to document personal data breach management and to manage that process. They also deal with vendor risk management, a key element in making sure that you are working with GDPR compliant organizations. They document your data inventory, deal with consent management, DPI process and assessment. So a GDPR management system. Wenso partner with the world's leading GDPR management systems, and we will be able to tailor products and services directly into your business environment. And then another key element of that are the cybersecurity systems. So the typical sorts of profiles of technologies you need for that are GDPR data classification tools, data discovery, data monitoring tools, data security, network intrusion, and incident detection. So if you don't have products and services that deal with this, and to be perfectly honest with you, most organizations, although they will have network intrusion and incident detection, they probably don't have an ongoing data monitoring service, and they probably don't have a GDPR data classification service. So these are elements which are available in the marketplace. They have been growing in the industry over the past 15 years, and they've been promoted much more heavily since the General Data Protection Regulation has come into force 2 years ago. So Wenso will work with you to develop these as part of your framework initiative, but if you wish to have standalone viewpoints looking at these, Wenso can certainly get in contact with you to detail those as well. So all that remains is for me to thank you very much for your attendance today. I appreciate that this has been quite an intense info burst, probably a little bit more than you were expecting. What we'll do is we'll get in contact with you after this session, and if necessary, we will share our slide deck with you so that you can review that offline. But please, we do encourage you to get in contact with us here at Wenso. We're here to help. We do operate in the UAE. We work with government agencies and a couple of other businesses, and we have live ongoing engagements out in the UAE, and we're growing our business engagements over there as well in 2020 and beyond. So by all means, thank you very much for your time today. If you've got any questions, just please field them through